Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 11, which is the chapter that talks about psychological disorders. I've mentioned to you before that each one of us is unique, and we have our own unique characteristics, our own things that are weird about us, and that's all right. That's good. I mean, people love us because we are the way we are, not in spite of the way we are. And so it's not bad to have our eccentricities and all of that. But once in a while, for some individuals, their characteristics become so extreme that it in fact does become problematic. And then it could be described as a psychological disorder. And we call something a psychological disorder if it's so extreme that it's causing you problems in your personal life, your relationships, your job, or at school, or maybe there's nothing that anyone else could see, but you're inside, you have great personal distress and turmoil. Then it could be considered a psychological disorder. And this chapter talks about many different categories of psychological disorders and a number of disorders within each category. Another good reference book that you could look at on psychological disorders is a book called The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, nicknamed the DSM. And you can find that in most libraries. And when it comes to diagnosing mental disorders, it's the Bible. I mean, it's the one. It's the one that psychologists use, psychiatrists, counselors, and on. People refer to that book. Psychiatric nurses refer to that book. And so, that book also spills out these different same categories and same disorders. And so today I'm going to talk about a few, not all, but a few of those categories. The first one I'm going to talk about today is the schizophrenias. 1 out of every 100 people on earth today, men and women, have schizophrenia. You may know a person who has schizophrenia, maybe even in your own family. Anyway, schizophrenia is a genetic thing, but it's not entirely genetic, because even if you have identical twins, sometimes one will get it and half the time the other one won't. And so it's partially genetic, but there are other factors involved as well with the development of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia usually comes on in young adulthood. Maybe you were perfectly, seemingly normal in high school and all of that, but then in young adulthood you began to be more and more withdrawn and aloof, and other strange things begin to happen too. Maybe your emotions flatten out and you're no longer showing a range of emotions, or if you do show emotions, your emotions are inappropriate. Or you may begin to have strange beliefs. Those are called delusions. Like maybe you have the delusion that everyone's out to get you. A very common delusion, by the way, with schizophrenia. And also, you probably will start to hallucinate. And the hallucinations could be in any one of the senses. You could see things that aren't there and whatnot, smell, hear, taste, whatever. But it's usually, with schizophrenia, it's usually auditory. People with schizophrenia oftentimes hear voices, people talking to them, people talking about them, maybe telling them to do things that are inappropriate and whatnot. And so hearing voices is very common with schizophrenia. Also, people with schizophrenia may have odd behaviors, like dressing up very strangely and going outside and so on. And so they may have acute phases, and then it may calm down for a while. But I have to tell you that there's excellent treatment for schizophrenia and really wonderful medication that can help a lot with that particular disorder. Another disorder category is called the anxiety disorders, and there's a whole range of disorders within that category. One of the disorders within that category is phobias, and we talked about phobias a little bit in the learning chapter. Those are always kind of fun to look at. Many of us have little phobias. I remember teaching this class of 95 students. And anyway, in that class, I asked students to bring in their pets, and little pets, And so someone brought in an albino snake, and I walked a little snake around the room, and one woman bolted for the door, and I said, "Don't worry, I won't stick it on you." A little albino thing with pink eyes, and I was encouraging people to touch it. And then someone else brought in a little mouse, and so I'm walking the mouse around. Again, some people, men and women, were terrified of the thing, which I thought was funny. It's always funny if it's not your phobia, right? But then one of my students came down front in this big auditorium, came down front. He said, "I brought my pet too." And I said, "Oh, what'd you bring for us today?" And he put out on the floor a tarantula. And he said to me in front of the entire class, "You're going to touch it, right?" And I'll tell you, that was one scary moment for me, because I knew I had to now. And so anyway, and usually with with animals, when people are scared of it, they kind of poke at the thing, you know, and then the animal gets even more scared. And I'm poking at this tarantula, and it knew that, and so it's like it's up on its haunches, and I thought, oh great, it's going to flip around and get me. But in fact, I did get up my courage. It was one of the bravest things I ever did, but I did touch it. Would you consider that a phobic disorder? Probably not, because it doesn't affect my everyday life. But if I refused to go into basements or garages and I slept with my light on every night because I was so afraid a spider might enter the room, yeah, that'd be called a phobic disorder in that particular case. All right, so there's phobias. Then there's also obsessive compulsive disorder. With obsessive compulsive disorder, you have unpleasant thoughts, obsessions. Those are called obsessions. Unpleasant thoughts that you can't get out of your mind. Like, I'm covered in germs and I'm going to catch a disease. Or, what else could we put here? Maybe my family's in some kind of danger. Or maybe I've sinned against God and I'm going to hell. You know, it could be any kind of unpleasant thought that keeps intruding in your mind and you can't seem to shove it away. Then people develop compensatory behaviors that are supposed to ameliorate or get rid of those things that they're afraid will happen. And sometimes they're clearly connected. Like a person who's afraid of dirt and germs may take up the habit of washing their hands 1,000,000 times a day till they're cracked and bleeding. A person who is always concerned for personal safety may do a lot of double checking. You know, they check the doors at night 2-3 times. Oh, 2-3 times. They might check them 20 times. A person with a disorder like this, they may double check the curling iron. They may make sure it's unplugged and double check this and double check that. They may actually leave for work and be halfway there and not be sure and turn around and go back home and double check everything again. Concern for personal safety. Or a person may have compulsions. Compulsions are behaviors. Obsessions are thoughts. Compulsions are behaviors. Or they may have compulsions also meant to get rid of those things they're afraid of or stop those things they're afraid of. But these compulsive behaviors aren't as obviously connected. Like a person that fears that they sinned against God, maybe they tap their toes a certain number of times and then they think everything will be okay now. So sometimes the behaviors are clearly connected, sometimes they're not. Or maybe you have to count backwards from 100 by threes and has nothing to do with the thing you're worried about, but somehow you think that it's going to make it not happen if you do that. And you feel this compelling force within you to tell you to do that, and you're very afraid not to. That's obsessive compulsive disorder. Another one in this category we hear a lot about these days, it's post-traumatic stress syndrome. And you know, with all the young and older men and women today in the armed services coming home after long tours of duty, very frightening circumstances, many of them do have post-traumatic stress syndrome. I've heard, especially if they've had any kind of head trauma, they do seem to have that more often. And so you may be left not being able to integrate back into your normal life because you keep having nightmares and flashbacks during the day where you're thinking about it and you're unable to relax and enjoy your life. And so you know, that could cause post-traumatic stress syndrome, or other things where you feel imminent danger of mortal bodily injury. You know, maybe a person is sexually assaulted or mugged, or they're in a fire or a terrible automobile accident. Or it may not even be yourself if you're afraid because you see your family member in terrible danger. That also could cause you to have post-traumatic stress syndrome. There are others in this category as well, but I have to tell you, the anxiety disorders, unlike many other very complicated disorders, these are pretty straightforward and pretty, I don't want to say easy to treat, but they're pretty fixable, I have to tell you, and really straightforward therapy for these. All right, another category would be mood disorders. Could be things like major depression. Well, we all get depressed now and then. Why is it called a disorder? Well, it's because the duration is longer than what would be typical. You know, you break up with a boyfriend. I would expect after a short while you're starting to get back on your feet. You know, but if you're still depressed after 6 months, you know, and you can't get back to your normal life, then it's maybe a disorder. Or maybe it's the intensity. You know, we all can feel a little blue, but you refuse to go to work or eat. You know, so those things could make it be called a disorder. And it isn't that you're wrong for being depressed. It's just that it's occurring at such a degree that it's impeding your well-being. You know, that's all. Or manic depression. Now it's called bipolar disorder, but frequently people still refer to it as manic depression, where you swing from one extreme to the other. So at one extreme, you're just giddy happy, don't need to sleep, hardly need to eat, zooming about, talking really fast, maybe spending all your money, maybe engaging in things that just don't show very good judgment, maybe driving the car really, really fast or whatever. And then down to a period of normal, and then down to depressed, and then later back on up to mania again. And so that sort of swing, by the way, there's really, really several good medications that can help with that sort of thing. Okay, and so depression, medicine, yes, but also regular, just talk therapy can sometimes help with that. All right, there are many other categories as well. I don't really have time to go through all of them today. Psychosexual ones are kind of interesting to look at. I always tell my students, if you're going to write on psychosexual disorders, you may be grossed out looking all that information up, but I guarantee you won't be bored. And so that includes not only the disorders of function, but it also includes all the kinky stuff, paraphilias, flashers, and exhibitionists, we could call those, or sadomasochists, or pedophiles, and on fit into that category. Then there's childhood disorders, many of them, and disorders of cognition that mostly affect older people. So there's so many disorders, I can't certainly go over all of them, but I wanted to mention a few for you today. All right, that's all for now.